So, okay, Matt, I think that we have to start our fire chat.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed your talk. I think it
you.
was super, super interesting. One of the questions that I had was, tell me a little bit more about the limitations of this technology. So where do you think that we are going to go, for example, in the next years, and where do you think that the things are going?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think some of what you were just talking about plays into it a lot. Is this connectivity between the human and the machine, as well as the machine and other machines. So one thing in particular is as I was mentioning, we tune everything to an individual user, a height, weight matched person. We're going to get them, collect all their data, and feed it into a single device. But everything we're learning about is that AI is most powerful when it can actually learn from large data sets. So not just an individual user, but any large set of data. So the data from you, the data from me, the data from other people walking around out there. I think as we go forward, we're going to need to find a way that we can actually bring in all that data in a way that we can share it, and that each of these individual systems can actually learn from each other, so that you can provide an even better experience. Yeah, I think that ability to process the data and understand how it can actually be used. So not just one torque that we put into the joint, but we can fine tune it. Like I was mentioning, the neuromuscular models. That's one approach to how we actually generate these biologically accurate torques. But there may be other solutions there that are beyond what we are able to perceive. And I think using this intelligence to help us identify what those torque profiles may be, or how we can actually allow people to share the personalization. Maybe I want to walk like you. I can just download your walking profile, and I can start to simulate that.
Do you envision problems with data privacy, for example?
Yeah, so of course that's the biggest thing, right, is that you can't just share individuals' data, or at least, okay, and when you look at something like Facebook, okay, people are starting to share a lot of their personal information, but when it comes to medical records, that becomes a much more personal, private thing, and that's the big question, and that's where the using some sort of blockchain ledger to anonymize but also distribute that data looks really interesting.
I think the key of this technology is that we will need a way in order to broadcast knowledge, but don't breach our privacy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that a ton of research is going to focus on that, in how to manage that trade-off.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That's actually one of the main notes I wanted to bring up is how do we distribute that? How do we separate those two things, the private information from the public information?
Well, I think that what we'll have is basically these entities, for example, like banks, for example, governments, managing your personal data, right? Yeah. And then you will be able to create personas out of this data that you have in order to manage your finance or your healthcare or many other things, right? Everything should be, the control plane of that should be these distributed consensus algorithms and distributed trust that I talk about, because at the end you all have an accountability and transparency there. So since many individuals in the world are starting to fear and starting to distrust their institutions, I think that this kind of distributed trust will solve a lot of problems.
Okay, so speaking of trust and distribution, one of the big things that always comes out of this is, what are the extents of the robot? I think of the robot as something that senses and can process that information and then interact on the world. When you start talking about distributed systems, where do those boundaries lie, or are there boundaries?
For me, as I said in the talk, I think a robot is a computer that can interact physically with its world, right?
So you think that's the physical aspect that's
correct.
Truly the
correct.
The separation.
It's something that you can program and something that applies forces in the environment. So at the end, we think about robots like drones, autonomous vehicles and all these kind of things, but there are so many other things. For example, the food computer, which applies forces in a mini environment with lights, with humidity, etc., right? I think other robots might be even social robotics, right? The robots that are in care institutions, even Alexa, could be considered as a robot, yeah, with a physical entity. I think we need to expand our vision of robotics and start to see that robotics are around us already.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is that distinction of the physical action. When you bring up Alexa is a weird one, because what is that physical interaction? I guess auditory.
Yeah, auditory, or also the interconnectivity with other parts of your home. For example, like putting up the blinders, opening the doors, like doing these kind of like things. So you can attach a brain and you can attach the muscle, right? So at the end, it's all the same robot, right?
Does any of this make you nervous? This level of connectivity. So, for instance, Alexa is in your house, and Alexa is controlling all these different aspects of your house, turning on your lights.
I think a lot of people have a problem right now because there is no transparent way, there's no verifiable way to understand what Alexa is doing. But in the moment that you put a black box, exactly the same way that a plane has, with the robotics that are in our home, then we shouldn't have any problem with that because you know the inputs. Maybe you don't know the algorithm inside, but you know the outputs, right? So you can log and verify that Alexa is doing what it's supposed to do. For example, it's not sending information to the people you don't want, like to send information to, right? I think that's the key. And I think that this concept of digital trust is so cornerstone of the next years that we are going to experience it.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's possible to hold on to that trust when the intelligence becomes so complex that it's hard for any one person to actually understand what the interconnections are.
I think we need proper interfaces. We need the new mouse, the new keyboard of this world, of the digital trust world. When we get this, things will be way easier. But I am wondering if the public has any kind of like questions or wants like to raise any concerns about what we said, maybe? Any fears, any joys?
I think there's a mic, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Okay.
Or not. Yeah.
The more the technology goes, it's louder. The outputs tend to be converged networks of information. So if you have access to that network, you have a virtual access to every function in the outputs, and it's very uneasy to control that output actually because it's all going through the same path. Or are you going to guarantee, I don't know, encryption, authentication, but this bus of information that you can already find in the cars and in most industry, it's always a problem in terms of how you can control what can be done and what's restricted. How do you do that?
So I guess that we will start to see like proxies. Yeah, we will start to see the role of banks. We'll start to see the role of governments being the proxy of your data in the world, right? So they will be able like to get a report about what information you have with your public key in a blockchain system. I think that this is possible. In a sense, what we showed here is the Windows 95 of digital trust. It's bulky, it's slow, and definitely needs improvement, but it's the first step of a new revolution. That is for sure. I strongly believe that.
To continue with the last question and your answer about this question, so basically what you're saying is that we're going in an era of decentralization with the blockchain, etc. And for you, your kind of sort of vision of authentication, and data is to give this data to institutions. So we want to decentralize information and access, etc. And you say that we give this data. Well, if you want to decentralize the data, you can't give it to one institution, the state, or the banks, etc., because the goal is to decentralize the data.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of
It's a
ambiguous role and relationship with what you're saying.
It's a trade-off. So what I say is that you personally can manage your own data. You will understand that your data is an asset, not something that basically goes out in the cloud, right? And you could manage that. Or you could basically leave somebody as a proxy of your account of personal data. That will also be a possibility in case you don't want to manage that. What I envision is a world in which instead of the data going to the algorithm, for example, you opening a Gmail account and basically Google reading all your emails and training their algorithms with the data, The algorithm will come to the data. So you will have a personal account with your data, and Google will query your data and say, hey, I want to have access to this particular information. For example, how much do you charge me for that query? So you will process that query. You will see that maybe Google cannot reinterpret your raw data, cannot recreate your raw data, and you will just give an answer to that data, an answer that cannot recreate your raw information. I envision that kind of system.
Another question, I agree with you that it's an asset, our data, but don't you think that it's a bit late in the sense that, look, Facebook is owning our photos. When you are connecting to the Google Gmail, it stocks all the data. You agree, you disagree with it? It's already there. Siri, Cortana, Alexa, all the voice demands that you are making to these systems, they're stocked, analyzed, to serve us better, but we actually don't get a lot. In the last 10 or 15 years, we have just a bit better interfaces, but we are not paid for all the data that we are giving, and it's not private actually. All these companies are already having it. It's huge amounts of data, and it's even getting now, we are now being recorded. System will analyze it, will make some vision recognition and all this stuff. So how would we catch up on that? I think it's kind of a bit late, no?
I am really amazed on the pessimistic view of the human race, in a sense. I think that we have a lot of work to catch up. That's correct. And I don't know how we're going to catch up. But what I know is that the system is going to change. And we basically will run a lot of computation on the edge of the network, on our side, on our personal data, and we will produce knowledge in that edge, and then we will push basically the knowledge to a centralized system like Facebook or Google in case, for example, they pay us. But we are so the key change is understanding that our personal data is an asset rather than something that just occurs. When this changes, we will catch up, I think. We'll invent new ways to catch up. I hope so.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to follow up on that real quick. I think that's what our earlier speakers were talking about, is that we're reacting to this technology that we've created, and all of a sudden it's rapidly become a part of our life. And now's the time to start really thinking about what are the implications of all of that as we step forward. So I think those are great questions to ask.
Definitely.
And you're offering one potential option of how we can address that.
Definitely. So I think, unfortunately, the time is up. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here with you.
One quick addition, because in the afternoon we have a workshop which is focusing exactly on the topic about data and data privacy and how we can do better. And feel free to join the workshop if you're interested.
Thank you very much. I will be there.